Welcome. It's my pleasure to introduce the first of the New Zealand Chamber's Women in Sustainability series. This series came about through the New Zealand Chamber Maya Women's Network, and we're fortunate to have the support and contacts of New Zealand's High Commissioner to Singapore, Her Excellency Jo Tyndall. Prior to her current role, Jo was New Zealand's Climate Change Ambassador and will talk today to her former colleague, Christiana Figueres. Christiana Figueres is a Costa Rican diplomat and an internationally recognised leader on global climate change. She's the former Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. Figueres assumed responsibility for the international climate change negotiations after the failed Copenhagen Conference of 2009. She directed the successful conferences of the parties from 2010 through to 2014 and culminated her efforts in the historical Paris Agreement of 2015. Since then, Figueres has continued to accelerate the global response of climate change. She founded Global Optimism, a purpose-driven enterprise focused on social and environmental change. Today, the conversation between Jo and Christiana will focus on Figueres' leadership in the global climate change community and her personal and professional journey. They discuss climate change in COVID times and the setbacks that leaders are distracted with by the immediate global pandemic. This is a heartwarming and an optimistic conversation, and I'm sure it will leave you inspired. The New Zealand Chamber is incredibly grateful for the support of the New Zealand High Commission and Forum for the Future in bringing this idea to life.
Christiana, thank you so very, very much for joining us today. It's wonderful to reconnect with you and to speak with you, and really to focus on not only the Paris Agreement journey and what's happened since then, but your personal journey as a global leader on climate change and sustainability. So I want to start by saying a decade ago, it's hard to believe it's a decade ago, you took on a very high profile and an extremely highly challenging role as Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, which you did for 5 critical years. But I want to begin by going a little bit further back and just asking what inspired you to seek that role with the UNFCCC, and was climate change something you were already passionate about and had been involved with up to that point?
Well, first, Jo, thank you very much for the invitation to have this lovely conversation with you. I've actually missed you because we worked so hard together for working through all of the torturous details of the Paris Agreement. And you were such a staunch, absolutely staunch, not just negotiator for your country, but such a staunch facilitator of the conversation among all 195 countries. You just were so instrumental yourself in bringing that agreement through. And I miss you. I miss working with so many wonderful people that we worked with way back then. But thank you very much for the invitation tonight, and delightful to see you and be in conversation with you. So to answer your question, actually, I didn't seek the responsibility. I was one of the very despondent country negotiators who were in Copenhagen. And I guess I self-describe myself as a survivor of Copenhagen negotiations, as many of us were. And as you remember, after that negotiation, the then Executive Secretary, Hugo de Boer, decided that he would leave his position. And then the United Nations opened up a search for a new Executive Secretary. And it never occurred to me that I should put my name forward. But the president of Costa Rica, the then president of Costa Rica, called me and said, "We would like to put your name forward. Would you agree to that?" And I had to give it a very, very good think, and thought about it for, I think, 2 weeks before I called him back and said, okay. I had already been very involved in climate negotiations. I had been negotiating for Costa Rica, for my own country, since 1994, and had definitely, as you have already identified, had already recognized that that was my passion in life. That I really, although I never studied any natural science, and everything to do with the science of climate change is very difficult for me, and I really have to make an effort to understand it because I'm a social scientist. I studied anthropology, and hence you would say, what on earth is an anthropologist doing in climate change? Which is a different story. But I had discovered in the mid-90s that climate change is what I wanted to devote my life to, mostly because I am a mother. And I discovered that I had witnessed the disappearance of a species of a golden toad that was endemic to one of our national parks in Costa Rica. I had seen the species when I was a child. And by the time I had my two children, that species was gone. And I just thought that is not the terms of reference of any parent to turn over a planet that is severely diminished. So out of my sense of responsibility of being a mother, that's where my passion for climate change started. And then was very, very quickly enhanced and deepened when I realized the social injustice of climate change, and how much more deeply it affects the most vulnerable populations in every country. So that's where, yes, I had discovered that. And I had worked with the Secretariat in many different ways. I had helped the Secretariat as a negotiator, but I had helped facilitate quite a few things. And so I thought I knew the Secretariat pretty well. But once I was made executive secretary and I got to the Secretariat, my huge surprise was how little I knew about what the Secretariat does. And if I were to put a number on it, I think I realized that I knew 5 or 10% of what the Secretariat does and was completely oblivious to the rest of the 90%. So I was delighted to join a fantastic team of people and learn the breadth and depth of the work of the Secretariat in 2010.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it wasn't until I took on a role as a chair, a co-chair of one of the negotiating bodies after Paris, that I became aware of the incredible work that people in the Secretariat do, and the hours, the whole nights they put into preparing stuff for negotiators to work on. It's truly incredible. And they're unsung heroes by and large.
They really are. And you know, and anecdotally, it goes all the way from, you know, the support to negotiators that you witnessed and hopefully enjoyed. But it goes all the way to the other extreme. The Secretariat is also responsible for all the logistics. And one of my funnest memories was when we were preparing the Lima negotiations, and we were given a green field, just a large extent of grass, beautiful grass. And we were told, here, build the negotiating center, here, build the convention center on a beautiful extent of grass, which is the responsibility of the Secretariat. And I remember, you know, being very, very careful and detailed in the construction of this and all the necessary things. And I was absolutely panicked about the toilets because they were non-permanent. They were very, very temporary toilets. And I remember asking our construction team every week, what are we going to do about the toilets? What are we going to do about the toilets? And we actually had to put them in, and we had to connect them to the municipal tubing, of course. And of course, because I was obsessing so much about the toilets, 2 days before everyone arrived, the toilets weren't working. And I was already there. And of course, we had wonderful laughs because they said, you know, if you hadn't asked us so much, you probably haven't jinxed this. But the dash that we did to make sure that the toilets were running. So the Secretariat is responsible for everything between toilets working all the way to the legal text that goes into the to any agreement that is assumed by government. So there you go. I never knew before that the Secretariat was also responsible for the toilet.
Christiana, early on you talked about your role and the traumatic memories of the Copenhagen conference, which people had gone into with such high hopes and which came up with such an incredibly disappointing result that really set negotiations back quite a long way. And I think at the time you joined as executive secretary at the UNFCCC, trust within the process and in the process was probably at its lowest ebb ever. So how did you go about rebuilding that trust? And as a woman, what did you bring, do you think, to a process which took some time to really get to a point of I don't know, the atmosphere in the place being a lot less toxic and much more potentially constructive?
Yeah. It was quite a journey. And as you point out, Joe, trust was basically non-existent because we all came out of Copenhagen with a conclusion that we would never be able to agree to a global path to decarbonization, and trust in the Secretariat was at -40, and trust in the process was at -40, and trust among country negotiators was at -40. I mean, it was just horrible. I remember, thinking, oh my gosh, this whole process, every single component of this process is in the trash can. And it was up to me to pick up the pieces in the trash can and see what we could make out of it. I do remember that my first priority was to build up the trust, the self-trust, the self-confidence of the team in the Secretariat. That was my absolute.
Very bruised.
They were very, very bruised, understandably, because they are 500 people who devote their entire life to this process. And they had devoted years to preparing Copenhagen. And they were blamed for a lot of everything that went wrong in Copenhagen, rightly or wrongly, but they were definitely blamed. And so, of course, they were totally demoralized. And so the first whole year, minimum, but more than that, but at least the first year, my first, second, and third priority was the Secretariat team itself. I really devoted myself to understanding everything that the Secretariat does, to getting to know all of these 500 people personally, understand what their skills were, what their weaknesses were, what their aspirations were, who they were as professionals, who they were as people, and begin a very, very detailed process of first self-confidence with each one individually. I mean, honestly, I was more like a psychologist to the Secretariat than anything else, to really repair the damage that was done and increase self-confidence first in each individual, then in the teams, and then in the Secretariat as a whole, so that they, the 500 in whose hands these processes are, that they would be the first ones to repair that that pain that they had felt when they were accused of being incompetent or anything else that they were accused of. And so it was quite a process to rebuild the trust in their own trust in their collective ability to hold and to lead this process. It did require a whole change of mentality and quite a bit of detailed work with each of them individually and with the teams for them to recuperate that. And then gradually I moved out and began working also with government negotiators, with representatives. I started traveling, going to capital cities, talking to heads of state, talking to the negotiators, and trying to understand where they were on this. A lot of them were also in pain because of Copenhagen. And it took a lot of listening. That's what I remember so clearly. A lot of asking a lot of questions and a lot of listening for me to understand where everyone was and for me to understand what the next steps could be for them if they took the decision and made the choice to begin to change their mindset. And I remember sort of building a mental map of everyone in the secretariat, of all of the negotiators, and then I brought in as well the stakeholders, which were the representatives of non-federal governments, non-national governments, the representatives of cities, of states, financial institutions, the First Nation people, the representatives of youth, scientists, the spiritual community. I mean, you name it, everyone that had something to contribute. Because the fact is, climate affects every single person on this planet. And I just couldn't conceive that it would be only federal government negotiators who would have the full responsibility. Yes, you had the responsibility to work on the text itself, but everything around that was actually carefully built to support that process and to contribute to the trust and the confidence in the process, basically through listening. And when you say, you know, what can women contribute, I think we are better listeners. And of course, that's a terrible generalization, and I always want to step away from generalizations. But since you asked me the question, I think women, we are better listeners than men. I think we're better at facilitating a process than directing the process. And that's what it really took, was to hold it and protect it and facilitate it rather than top-down direction that would impose one person's view. And I think we're also much better at collective leadership. That was, for me, the most important, to really be mindful of promoting and fertilizing collective leadership about everything. I mean, obviously, at some point, if there is a discrepancy in opinions, one person has to make the final decision. But it was not very often that I had to do that. There, you know, most of the decisions along the whole way were made collectively because of the trust that had grown in collective ability to hold the process and be able to deliver.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful because as you said, I think the governments, the parties to the negotiations had really kind of constrained what they would allow the Secretariat to do, or at least you know, in public to do. So you didn't have too many influencing tools in the toolbox. But what I'm hearing is something that starts at the core, at the self, with the self, but kind of radiates out from that to build a change of mindset. And that, I think, is the most significant and incredible thing, to go from within a 5-year period of the whole thing seeming impossible, we would never have a global agreement on climate change, to 5 years later being able to watch Laurent Fabius gavel down the Paris Agreement at Le Bourget.
And to do that with unanimity, right? It wasn't even consensus, because as you will remember, there were several COPs before that where we adopted the conclusions or the decisions by consensus, and there were 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 countries that didn't agree. But in Paris, we made sure that there was a unanimous decision. So that was, and we had decided that 2 years ahead of time that we would go for nothing other than unanimity.
Yeah, and well, yes, the euphoric feeling of that night, you know, will never
remains with all of us.
And that was obviously the most visible and public and global success. Just interested in hearing from you a couple of your biggest frustrations along the way, but also whether there were other successes or turning points along the way that you felt particularly proud of.
Well, let me start there. I was particularly grateful for the change in esprit de corps at the Secretariat, because I totally understood that unless that were in place, there was nothing there to hold, support, guide the negotiations. And I must say, I have never worked with a more devoted, dedicated, hardworking team of people than at the Secretariat. I remember several times in which governments had not paid their dues to the Secretariat, and we had a very, very tight budget. That meant that we couldn't do many of the things that we wanted to do to support the team. And I was always faced with having to announce to the colleagues that we cannot do this, or we cannot pay them the full daily stipend that they were allowed to, for example, when they went to a COP. And my question always was, here are the conditions. We can't pay you the full thing. We're going to pay you, you know, whatever, 80% or whatever it was. And anyone who does not want to go will not be reprimanded, you know, totally understandable, because COPs are very, very difficult, very hard work. Everybody works at least 20 hours a day, as you all know. And I didn't feel that it was fair to expect them to work 20 hours a day for 80% of pay. And so I said, you know, anybody who wants to get off, please let me know, you know, just here's the list, just get off the duty list and I'll find someone else to do it, or we'll make other arrangements. Never did anyone get off, ever. Everyone gave their absolute best. And I remember being just incredibly grateful when I would tour the Secretariat offices at 3, 4, 5 in the morning, when negotiators were hopefully getting 2 winks of sleep, and everybody in the Secretariat was still there. You know, and still working hard. And I would bring around food and liquids for them, because I was just so grateful for that amazing team of people. Now, you also asked about frustrations. I have to say, do I say this in public? Yes, I think I'm far away now enough from the UN that I can say this in public. I was incredibly frustrated by the UN administrative constraints. It is an institution that our world should never be without. It is a completely unique institution that was created, as we know, at a historical moment in which it was necessary to have this hub of multilateralism. And I would never want to live in a world without a United Nations. Having said that, after 7 decades, that institution has grown to be incredibly heavy in its processes and procedures. And a lot of the innovation that we thought was necessary for an agreement was curtailed by the administrative constraints of the UN. For example, hiring people. We were with the Secretariat, I'm not a we anymore, the Secretariat was the most efficient, because we had really worked on hiring processes. We were the most efficient UN agency for hiring, and it took us 6 months to hire anyone. The UN average for hiring is at least 12 to 18 months. So you can imagine when you have a task that needs to be done and it's time sensitive, and you know you can't get anyone that is specialized in this for at least 6 months, and 6 months if you're very lucky. It was just incredibly frustrating. So that, together with the always insufficient funding that the Secretariat had, out of understandable reasons that many countries couldn't pay their fees, those two were really very frustrating. And they were, you know, they're constraints, working constraints. What they did for us, however, is they forced us into innovative thinking. Because if we had had all the people that we needed or all the funding that we needed, we probably wouldn't have been forced into those, you know, Friday night, 10 o'clock at night sessions. So, you know, now we're going to do 3 hours of brainstorm because by Monday, we need to have a completely new way of doing X, Y, Z, because we just don't have the people or the funding to do it the way that we used to. And so that forced innovation and that forced creative thinking. And I think it, you know, woke up even more esprit de corps among all of us who were working under very tough conditions.
Yeah, no, that's and I think that played out. I think, trying to think, it's less so amongst the Secretariat, but certainly amongst those others involved in the process. While overall there's a lot of women, once you get up to head of delegation level or senior levels, the numbers really kind of thin out. But in the lead up to and at Paris, there were a few women in some very important positions. Yourself, Laurence Tubiana, as the chief French negotiator, to name two. So do you think, how important a role do you think women played in achieving the outcome?
I think you all were very important.
No, you all.
I must say, well, including you and you, Joe, as I said at the very beginning, played such an important role as co-chair of the APA, which was the negotiating body that delivered the Paris Agreement, and also during your time as vice president of the Bureau. And I was incredibly grateful always for your insight and your very down-to-earth reasoning that wasn't, you know, hot-headed at all, and just delightfully lucid. But in terms of other women, you know, I remember the COP that I was really completely bowled over by the leadership of women was COP 17 in Durban, South Africa, because there we had the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who was the COP president, who was a woman. We had, that was Minister Mashabane. We had her first person in command, who was doing all of the heavy lifting for her, the head of negotiating for South Africa for the presidency, who was Ambassador Diseko, who you know very well, and ended up being the chair of the G77. We had Sandy DeWitt, who was the second person in command there, also an incredibly powerful and capable negotiator. And then myself as a woman, and the head of security for COP17 was a female. And so it was such fun meetings, I must say, where we had the president of the COP, the head negotiator who always brought Sandy with her, the head of security, and myself. And then there was maybe one or two men in the room. But when we got together to review where we were and what we had to do and what, you know, issues were coming up, it was all these women in the room. And it was such a fun COP for me, because I had never been in a situation in which it was the women calling all the shots. And it was just very unusual for me and fun. It doesn't mean that we always saw eye to eye. We had many differences of opinion among us. But there was this sort of, I think, twinkle in our eye that we all knew that we were doing something that was very unusual. And so, you know, so delightful. Now, after COP17, as you have mentioned, we had many people in the negotiating teams. Laurence, who played such an absolutely brilliant job in the whole run up to Paris, the whole year before Paris. Mary Robinson, who wasn't a negotiator, but was holding the fort for women's issues and for human rights, the former president of Ireland. We had Tara Shine, who was working with her. We had Farhana Yamin, who is British, but negotiated for the small island states. I mean, we had Lorena Aguilar, also from Costa Rica. We had so many brilliant women, and how fun it was to look out onto that, you know, vast hall of negotiators and compare in my mind to the composition that was there in 2010 when I first took over. Definitely an improvement in female ratio versus men. Every year there was more and more women in that negotiating hall. And I think it made a difference. I think, you know, women, we, as I said before, we tend to listen to each other a little bit more than most men. We tend to have a more long-term view of things, and climate is about long-term view. And I think we also tend to be more inclusive and more collaborative. It doesn't mean that we always agree with each other, as I've already said, but I think our home base from which we act is much more collective and collaborative than most men. And that makes a huge difference, as you know very well, in a complex process such as the climate negotiations.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. It's always quite easy to kind of hold things back, disrupt or delay. It's much more challenging and requires a very different mindset to try and find that small area of common ground and move things forward. Now, I want to move beyond the UNFCCC because that marked the first half of the last decade and onto the second half. So leaving that role not that long after the Paris Agreement was seen through, I'm sure you had very mixed feelings about going. But it's a bit like that Eagles song, Hotel California. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. You went on from the UNFCCC to carry out your work on climate change as, I guess, a global activist. but in a very unique to you way. I think it's clear to anyone that meets you or hears you speak that you are a completely gifted communicator. I'm interested to know, first of all, whether this was a skill you were born with, something you've developed or honed over your career, and what you might say to other women who might want to tell a powerful sustainability story.
What an interesting question. Did I learn it, or where did it come from?
So in my perception was that you became more of a front person or a cheerleader, a global cheerleader over the course of your time at the UNFCCC, but maybe that was just because of the way your focus shifted out from the core to the ripples across the pond.
Yes, that is very, very true. I definitely started at the epicenter, right, with the Secretariat, and then as time went on and as the process matured, then moved out into, I think you used a beautiful word before, you said radiating. So radiating out into the outside world. But, you know, as I think about communication on a topic as complicated as climate, and especially in a climate that was as toxic as it was when I started, I think post factum, I'm not sure that I did this consciously, but post factum, I would say there are two things that I think were very helpful. One was to communicate things as simply as possible. Some people tend to complicate what they're trying to explain because they're concerned about being, you know, giving the complete answer with all of the integrated details, etc. And I have always believed, and I think it's a trait that I learned from my father, that simple is best. And short is definitely better than long in terms of communication, especially if it's verbal communication. Written communication, you can afford the luxury of making something much longer. But in verbal communication, it's just a fact that we humans don't have the capacity to focus for very long. And so very short, concise, clear communication is very helpful. I also think that I learned from my father to communicate in what I call pictures, in analogies, and be able to explain complicated issues by using a metaphor or an analogy that is much simpler to grasp. Especially important with the press, because the press, they don't live climate day in and day out like the negotiators do. And yet I depended on the press to communicate to the outside world. So I was very intent on being able to communicate to them in ways that would be easier for them to explain. So I think short, clear, and vivid communication that uses visual images and analogies and metaphors was very helpful to me. And the other thing, when you said, what would you say to other women who want to communicate? Joe, it comes as no surprise to you that I am so passionate about climate change. And I feel so deeply the injustice that is being done, especially to young people and to vulnerable people around the world. That very often when I was asked a question about young people or vulnerable people, I would tear up, and I would tear up in public. In the beginning, I was mortified about that. And I thought, I've got to get hold of these tears because, you know, what are people going to say? And, you know, I came to the conclusion that I didn't have to be afraid of being vulnerable, because it was really me. It was my passion. It was my concern. It's my pain around what is happening that was tearing me up. And being vulnerable in public just means being authentic, being me, who I am as a person, independently of who I am as executive secretary, et cetera, et cetera. And I actually appreciate when someone else is vulnerable with me, because then I feel that I can have a direct conversation that goes heart to heart in addition to head to head. And when you can have a conversation that is at both of those levels, heart to heart and head to head, you have a much deeper conversation that is much more transformational for both of you. And so, you know, my humble suggestion to both men and women, is more difficult for men than it is for women. All of us who work on climate change or any other sustainability issue, we do so out of our concern for the quality of life on this planet and for the quality of life of future generations and for the quality of life of those who cannot express themselves and who don't have a microphone in front of them. And if we speak out of that pain, we speak louder and more compellingly, because we're speaking for them. Future generations don't have a microphone today, and vulnerable people don't have a microphone right now. We have to speak for them because they can't speak for themselves. And don't be afraid to be vulnerable, because it shows that you are really committed to the work that you're doing. I don't appreciate people who go to their office with their brain on and work from 9 to 5 and leave their heart at home or their soul at home, and then they pick it up at 6 p.m. when they come home. That was before COVID. I much rather interact with a person who is there with all of their brain, and I certainly had excess of brains around me in the process up to the Paris Agreement. Thank heavens, so many capable, dedicated people. But I also wanted to have a relationship with who they were as people. What did their souls say? What did their hearts say? Because that pushes everyone to go just that mile further. That could be the difference between failure and success. And so when you ask me what is my suggestion for women who want to communicate both out of your head and out of your heart, because it's much more compelling and convincing.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly powerful message. Now, of course, this being 2020, we couldn't get through the entire interview without mentioning COVID-19. So you have mentioned it. And I think in that context, what has become clear is that leaders with empathy are so important.
Such as your own, congratulations. Such as your own head of state, congratulations. What a quality of a woman and a leader.
Yep, thank you on her behalf. I think she has had so many crises she has needed to deal with one way and another since. And of course, we were together with her in New York a couple of years ago, which was fantastic. So after Paris and now with the pandemic, there have been a couple of setbacks on climate change. It was disappointing, hugely disappointing to all of us, I think, that the US made the decision to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And the pandemic this year, I think, has been a major distraction for many leaders and many governments. It's the urgent, it's the immediate, and there's been, you know, we can stop at nothing to try and help us collectively get through this. So there's a risk, I guess, that we have taken our eye off the climate change ball when, in fact, that as a global disaster will make the pandemic pale into insignificance. There is a bit of a slogan about building back better, and doing so, thinking about the investments that are made into infrastructure and so on in ways that have sustainability, that have climate change at their core. And it's really pleasing to see that is being picked up here in Singapore with comments that are coming out and policies coming out. It's also been something that I'm sure not only New Zealand, but your own country, Costa Rica, has been bearing in mind. But how do you think governments and businesses can be convinced to build back better and to get their eye back on the climate change ball at the same time as dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, such an important question. So I do know that many people are using that slogan of building back better. I'm not quite comfortable with that slogan, honestly, because even if it's better, I don't believe in building back. I believe in building forward. And with respect to climate change and what we have to do, we totally have to be looking forward and already anticipating what we know is coming at us. Now, we do know that the economic recovery packages that are being designed will have a huge effect on whether we're able to get on track with decarbonization or not. And we know from climate science that in order to avoid the worst of climate change, we have to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 1/2 by 2030. And so that means this is the decisive decade in which we totally have to get back on track. Now, it so happens that the economic recovery packages of COVID are already at $12 trillion globally and will maybe go up to $20 trillion. What that means is that we have that amount of money that is going into the global economy as fresh capital that wasn't there before, never happened before at that level. And all of that capital is going to be deployed over the next 18 months. Because of the level of that capital, anywhere between 12 and 20 trillion, because of the level and because of the speed with which it's going to be deployed, it will determine the carbon intensity of the economy, of the global economy, not for 18 months, but for at least a decade, if not longer. And it so happens that is exactly the same decade in which we have to halve our emissions. So what that means is that, yes, these crises have all converged: the health crisis, the economic crisis, the climate crisis, and if you want to look further than that, the biodiversity crisis and the inequality crisis. They've all converged. We have to converge the solutions to all of them as well, because there's no way that we're going to have the bandwidth or the financing to meet all of those crises sequentially, one after the other. And so for the first time, I think we're all waking up to the challenge of converging the solutions. What that means is green recovery packages, such as the packages that are being put forward in the European Union, where the capital that is being injected into sectors and companies to revive them, to bring them back into operation, are either being deployed into companies and sectors that are green by definition, or they're being deployed into companies and sectors with green strings attached means conditionalities that tell, for example, the airline industries, yes, we will help to bail you out, but you have to continue the decarbonization process that you were in before and accelerate it. And that's going to be necessary. That's going to be necessary because we have to be, jobs are going to be created over the next 18 months with this capital. And those jobs have to be green and have to be long-standing. What good is it to open up, I don't know, a coal mine or a coal plant and give some jobs to people when we know that the whole coal industry is a stranded asset and is on the demise anyway? And so those jobs will be lost 2 or 3 years from now anyway. That doesn't make any sense. We have to open up the jobs in the sectors that we know are long-standing sectors. And finally, Joe, let me say this. Those 12 to 20 trillion dollars are not capital that the governments had in their pockets. That is capital that all the governments are borrowing. They're going into debt. What that means is that you and I will not pay that debt. It will be the next generation who pays that debt. And if we are borrowing against the future generations and they're going to pay the financial decisions that we're taking, we better make sure that that capital is being invested to their well-being, to their benefit, and not to rob their future. Because if we rob them of the future and we pass them the financial bill and the environmental and the social bill, what kind of human beings are we? We are going to pass the financial bill to them, but we better pass that bill with a global economy that has been decarbonized and has moved over to being stable, healthy, safer, and more just. It's the only thing we can do as responsible adults.
Yes. Now, Christiana, I think that in various ways, the word optimism is associated very, very strongly with you. That is a core part of your mindset and your approach to dealing with a global problem like climate change and with the other global problems we've just been talking about, whether it's stubborn optimism, outraging optimism, or the organization you founded, Global Optimism. I think that, you know, my reading is for example, the book you published recently, The Future We Choose, is very much centered on the idea that changing the world is not something separate from changing oneself, and thinking about changing a mindset. And that seems to have been a theme that you know, has played through this interview, this discussion today.
Sure. Sure.
So I would I was going to encourage everybody to read your book, but
well, please do. Thank you for that.
The Future We Choose. But I think, you know, the book sets up this stark and very obvious choice between a kind of an apocalyptic focus on the dire straits the planet is in right now, and the future we could have if we change our mindset and if we change our actions. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to do a promo on your book, and the fact that it is written from a point of view of optimism and from the point of view of what we as individuals can do to help send those ripples out to the edge of the pond.
Exactly. Well, thanks, Joe. That's very sweet of you. Yeah, the promo that I would do about the book is that it is a book about climate change, and it's not a complex book. It's an easy read. It's relatively short. It's probably read in an hour and a half or two. It's, yes, we present climate science, but in a very digestible way. And we introduce you to the two worlds that Joe has described, the world that we're heading for, unless we make some changes, and the fantastic world that we could have if we make the changes on time. And it is written out of optimism. And when we talk about optimism, my co-author and myself, Tom Ribbett-Carnan, when we talk about optimism, we don't talk about a naive faith that everything is going to be okay, it doesn't matter what we do. And it's also not about blindness about the science of climate or the impacts that we're already having. That's not what we mean by optimism. What we mean by optimism in the book, and also how we describe it and discuss it in our podcast, which is outrage and optimism, is a choice. It is a choice that we have to make every day about our sense of confidence, of conviction, that yes, we're in dire straits, for sure, we cannot deny that. But as humankind, we can collectively harvest the ingenuity and the skill set necessary to meet this challenge. That's what the optimism is about. It's an optimism about who we are as humans. There's no guarantee of success in the story of climate change. There's no guarantee. But what we do know is that failure, not even trying to succeed, is completely unacceptable. And the difference between success and failure is probably how you think about it. And if if you don't believe me, think about something that you want to do personally. Think about, I don't know, if you want to run a marathon, or you want to learn, a new genre of dancing, or you want to learn a new language, or you want to lose weight, whatever personal goal you have. If you go into that goal and you go, oh, well, it would be really nice to run a marathon, but I don't think I'm going to be able to do it because X, Y, Z. You probably won't. If you go into it and you say, wow, running a marathon is really difficult, so I'm going to have to really buckle down here, and I'm going to have to exercise the rigor that it takes. And I can do that. I'm going to go into my calendar and I'm going to block my training time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, that's not a guarantee that you're going to be the winner of the marathon, but it's probably a very good start to making sure that you can do a decent marathon. That's what I'm talking about. It's about the attitude with which you go in. So it's not the result of an achievement. Optimism is not about a celebration because we achieve something. Optimism is an input, a necessary input to any challenge that you have in your life, or any challenge that we have as human beings on this planet. That's what optimism is. And without it, frankly, we might as well just sit back and wait for failure. And that, in my book, is unacceptable. So there are not that many options. We can despair and plunge into paralysis. We can deny that it's all happening and hope that it's going to go away. Or we can be stubbornly optimistic and decide every day to renew our conviction that individually we can't do this, but collectively we can. And we can.
Yeah, and I think to finish on an optimistic note, we are seeing some good, very, very promising green shoots, whether that's at a government level, at a local city or regional level, at a company or business level, and at an individual level, where the awareness and the sense of urgency to do something it's changing. The world is changing. So let us hope we can get at least halfway through this damn marathon, and even better, get to the finish. My last question, Christiana. you started by talking about being a mother and what got you into climate change in the first instance. And as a mother too, I feel very strongly about that. So I want to ask what you hope for yourself, your family, your country, and for humanity.
Well, for all of that, because my wish and desire is the same for that whole universe that you've just named. I want a world that is more healthy, at the individual level and at the planetary world, planetary level. I want a world that is more stable, that is more resilient to whatever is going to come our way. And above all, I want a world that is more just, more just. The social injustice of climate change is, it's difficult for me to even address it. It is so painful, it is so deep, it is so cruel. It's simply unacceptable. And so above all, I want a world that is more just.
Well, let us finish on a note of optimism. We will get there. I think we will get there. It may be just in time, but let us hope we will get there.
No, I think we will, Joe. And as you said, we're seeing so much change, right, in technology and financial shifts, in just the capacity that everyone has to understand what is going on. I'm also seeing shifts in political winds. So it's actually quite exciting. And I must say, I just think it is an incredible blessing that you and I are alive right now, and that everyone who's listening here is alive right now, because we are witnessing and participating in the most radical transformation that humankind has ever embarked in. And how lucky are we to be alive right now and to help that transformation. So I feel incredibly blessed and very grateful to be alive. And I am definitely planning on being around here for quite a few more decades until I can then rest assured that we're turning over a stable planet to the next generation.
Cheers to that. Let us finish on that note. Thank you so much for your time, Christiana. It's been wonderful talking to you today.